Every week, the Payne family cuts straight to the real financial story.
The one question, Bob, everyone's asking is, are we in an artificial intelligence bubble? You've been through boom and bust. What do you think?
No hype, no myths. Just what actually matters to your money.
Does feel very similar to what we experienced in the 90s. Where are we, though? Are we in 1995, 1997, 1999?
Listen to the Pain Points of Wealth on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Roger Stone Show on this cold Sunday. One of my great regrets was that on January 9th, last Friday, I had laryngitis so bad that I wasn't able to do my regular show. The great Greg Kelly graciously stepped in for me. He's extraordinarily well-dressed and talented and interesting man, true patriot. Because that was the birthday, the 113th birthday of my political mentor, Richard Milhouse Nixon, the most reviled, at the same time most polarizing, but among the most respected men in the country. Richard Nixon survived in 40 years at the top of the political game, coming back from 2 back-to-back defeats to win the presidency, as improbably as that was, because he was a man of true grit and determination. And his legacy improves as more people focus on his actual record of accomplishments rather than entirely on Watergate. We'll talk about Watergate in a moment, but as president, it's interesting when you go to social media and ask for his greatest accomplishments, they cite, of course, the great opening of China, communist China. People who try to blame Nixon today for the fact that China is a dangerous and menacing enemy don't understand history. At the time that Richard Nixon brought the Chinese in out of the cold in order to strategically play them off against the Russians, with whom they had a multi-hundred-year history of hostility. Although both communists, they share a very long border and did not consider each other friends, although technically allies. There was no way for Richard Nixon to know that the China that he recognized, a poor, backward agrarian society where very few people had indoor plumbing and rural areas had no electricity, would later, 30 years later, be given most favored nations trading status by President Bill Clinton, and then with extensive other trade advantages given to them by George H.W. Bush. That's what got them to money to get the military to become a menace to our country today. But it ended more than 20 years of isolation between the two countries. It reshaped all global geopolitics and exploited the Sino-Soviet split that was very prevalent. Joe Biden's, among the worst things he did was driving the Chinese and the Russians back together, because the Russians share with us a terrible problem with Islamic extremism. So, but what's more interesting is when you go to social media, they mention the opening to China correctly. They also mention the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, which helped slow the nuclear race with the Soviets and saved our country hundreds of millions of dollars in defense spending. Richard Nixon was the first and only president in recent American history to actually cut defense spending. They cite, of course, his formulation and establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency. At the time, America had no environmental protection from the government, and as Teddy Roosevelt knew, there were unfortunately people who would despoil the environment in order to make a profit, people dumping toxics into the rivers, like the one that caught on fire outside of Cleveland. Richard Nixon would be rolling in his grave if he saw the level of over-regulation by EPA today. But Lee Zeldin, former congressman from New York, one of President Trump's very best appointees, doing a very good job to bringing that agency back to its traditional and more effective role of actually protecting the environment at the same time not harassing businessmen who are not polluting or doing anything illegal. Of course, then there is additionally the end of the war in Vietnam at a much faster schedule than the Pentagon wanted. Nixon recognized early, as did John F. Kennedy, that despite Lyndon Johnson greatly increasing our presence of troops and armaments and bombing in Vietnam, all the while he and Lady Bird's Bell helicopter and Sikorsky and General Dynamics stock was going into the stratosphere. Old LBJ made a fortune on the Vietnam War. Nixon concluded that the war had to be wound down, and he sought help from the Russians to do it. The Russians were concerned about our growing relationship with China, and he ended the war on a faster timetable. There is, of course, a story pushed by Lawrence O'Donnell and others on the left that during the end of the 1960 campaign, Richard Nixon, working through his Attorney General campaign manager, John Mitchell, and also a very famous Chinese dragon lady in Washington, a socialite, that Nixon had basically passed the words when Johnson called a bombing halt just before the 1968 election, which was a naked attempt to get Hubert Humphrey, who was coming on strong despite a split party at the end, over the finish line. Johnson had no concessions from the North Vietnamese to justify the bombing call, and I think the bombing halt did not bring them to the table immediately. So I think it was a political gambit. It was rumored, of course, that Anna Chennault, the Washington socialite, beautiful Chinese woman, had been the widow of General Claire Chennault, who was the head of the famous Flying Tigers, one of the most famous Air Force attack groups, Army attack groups, actually, in American history. It was rumored that Chennault had told the North Vietnam ambassador to tell the North Vietnamese that they should not come to the peace table because Nixon allegedly would give them a better deal when he was president. The problem is that Luke Nichter, who is an author, a very respected historian, basically debunks this entirely. There is no actual evidence of it. There's anecdotal stories told by people who may have been bragging about things that never actually happened, but Nixon did end the war in Vietnam. But what's not mentioned in AI, amazingly, is Nixon's desegregation of the public schools. See, when Richard Nixon became president, almost 82% of the public schools, both North and South, were still segregated. Nixon appointed a task force that included later Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York, the secretary then, I think, of George Shultz, who would later become Secretary of State. But at that point, I believe he was Secretary of Commerce or the Budget at the time, as well as Attorney General John Mitchell. And they persuaded every school board in the country, rather than fight in court, to desegregate their schools. By the time Richard Nixon left office, only 17% of public schools were segregated. That number was, I believe, 82 when he came into the presidency. He also, of course, gave us the policy of affirmative action, which many of my conservative friends do not like, but the idea that those who've been disadvantaged should get some advantages in federal contracting and business. Nixon also desegregated the construction trade unions under the Philadelphia Plan. He, of course, in 1958, it was Nixon who rounded up the key Republican votes necessary to pass the first civil rights legislation since the Civil War. Lyndon Johnson, the Senate Majority Leader, wrote this famous Southern Manifesto of Opposition, signed by every Southern Democrat but Johnson. Johnson was planning to run for president, so he wrote it and had his cronies like Richard Russell, very respected Georgian in the Senate, carry that ball. It was Richard Nixon, according to a letter from Dr. Martin Luther King, that we're going to talk about a little later. It was Nixon who rounded up the Republican votes necessary to pass that civil rights legislation. So it is, when you look at it overall, it's an extraordinary record of accomplishment. He also started the war on cancer. Two greatest mistakes, yes, let's say them right up front: abandoning the gold standard, horrific mistake, talked into it, interestingly, by Secretary of the Treasury John B. Connally, Big John, former governor of Texas, who, of course, was famously wounded in the presidential car on November 22nd, 1963, would later go on in 1972 to nationally head Democrats for Nixon and then formally switch parties, become Treasury Secretary under Nixon, and then make his own a very expensive but not very successful bid for the Republican nomination in 1980, a race in which he was crushed by both Richard Nixon and, to his consternation, another Texan that Connally deeply disliked, George H.W. Bush. So it is, of course, now to turn to Watergate. We have declassified documents now. James Rosen of Newsmax wrote very extensively and convincingly about this, that proved that the Central Intelligence Agency was well aware of the planned Watergate break-in in advance, that they infiltrated the burglar team, at least 4 of the Watergate burglars, including Eugenio Martinez, who I interviewed for my book on Richard Nixon. It's called Tricky Dick, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Richard M. Nixon. Eugenio Martinez and 4 other of the Cubans on the Watergate burglar team were still on the payroll of the CIA, as was James McCord, who ultimately busted the case wide open. He was the director of security at the committee to re-elect the president, but he was also a big-time spook who had worked his whole life for the agency. And, of course, E. Howard Hunt, one of the Watergate burglars, famously a CIA operative who had been deeply involved in the takedown of Guatemala, as well as other CIA dirty tricks. Nick Ackerman, who you'll sometimes see on NBC try to hold himself out as some kind of nonpartisan, bipartisan former prosecutor, actually a virulent partisan. I actually have a tape of him saying, "We know Nixon approved the break-in. We could just never find proof of it," which is a heck of a statement for a lawyer. There was no evidence that Nixon knew in advance about the break-in at the Watergate. And as a grizzled veteran of being on the national ticket 6 times, he knew there was nothing of value to find at the Democrat National Committee. So the Watergate narrative grows dim, particularly in view of the fact that the deep state that tried to take Nixon down, we'll talk about why in a minute, are the same folks who killed John F. Kennedy, the same people who tried to take out Ronald Reagan and tried to kill Donald Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania. We'll be right back.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And we were talking about the 113th birthday of former President Richard Nixon. Just still aggravated that I had laryngitis that day. I couldn't do my show. 1968, Nixon had, of course, lost the 1960 election by a whisker. Extensive evidence of voter fraud, not just in Illinois, but in Texas. President Dwight Eisenhower, New York Governor Tom Dewey both urged Nixon to challenge the elections, but he knew that if he did, he would go down in history as a sore loser and never have another shot at the brass ring. Then he made a disastrous 1962 race for governor of California. Once again, Eisenhower and Governor Dewey and a number of influential California Republicans convinced Nixon that he needed to be governor of the Golden State in order to have a political base to stay alive politically. And, of course, that was incorrect. But the Vietnam War, the murder of John F. Kennedy, the murder of Robert F. Kennedy, the senator from New York, on the eve of the California primary, the murder of Martin Luther King, parted the seas in a way that could never have been foreseen. And Richard Nixon made what was, until Donald Trump, the single most amazing and improbable comeback in American politics. Now, Nixon was not an introspective guy. It was very hard to get him to talk about the past. Eisenhower, McCarthy getting stoned in Caracas, Henry Kissinger, except for when he had a couple cocktails. And I used to go up to his place in Saddle River every Friday for meetings because I was working on his schedule and so on. And he then, after we finished working, he would make us a couple martinis. Here's his recipe. If you go to my book, Stone's Rules, you'll find the recipe for Dick Nixon's Silver Bullet. This is a recipe that the 37th President of the United States told me personally. You get a bottle of olives, you drain the olive juice, you fill it with water, you mix vigorously, you drain the water, and you fill the bottle with dry vermouth. Then you put it in the refrigerator to chill it. You take your glass, which has been in the freezer and is pre-chilled, you leave it there. Now you take a silver or an aluminum cocktail shaker, preferably an old Tiffany shaker from the 30s. You fill it with ice, and then you cover it with either vodka or gin. The old man favored gin. I'm more of a vodka man myself. And you shake extremely vigorously. If you don't have tiny shards of ice on the surface, then you haven't shaken vigorously enough. You pour the vodka or gin into the glass, and then you take 2 or 3 olives from the jar and you place them in the glass. That's Dick Nixon's Silver Bullet, as he called it. Now, when I said, Mr. President, that's a great recipe, this is a great martini, he said, yeah, I got the recipe from Winston Churchill. So that is the story of Nixon's Silver Bullets. When he had more than one, he became loquacious. He was famous for not being able to hold his alcohol. And it was then, of course, when I asked him what really happened in Dallas in 1963, and he shuddered and looked at me and said, well, let me put it to you this way. Lyndon and I both wanted to be president, but I wasn't willing to kill for it. So there it is. Richard Milhouse Nixon, 6 times on the national ticket. The 37th President of the United States, a man who was forced to resign in a political lynching by the deep state, but returned to become a statesman and advise both Republicans and Democrats. The greatest single title that history can bestow is that of peacemaker. And Richard Nixon was a peacemaker in his time.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Roger Stone Show. The United States of America is once again facing a constitutional crisis. A crisis not on distant battlefields, but in the streets of Minnesota, where violence has escalated and civil order is now completely frayed. What began as protests tied to federal immigration law enforcement and resistance to it has metastasized into sustained unrest, exposing a much deeper national question, in my opinion. Who enforces the law when local and state officials are too woke and refuse to do so? If you think that President Donald Trump's open admission that he is seriously considering invoking the Insurrection Act of 1807 to restore order in Minnesota is too extreme, listen to this short message from one of the leaders of Black Lives Matter in Minnesota.
Shut these streets down again. Make the city pay again and again. They was worried about losing money when George Floyd died. We as a people can cause them to lose more money now. If we don't stand together, we're going to fall. Together we stand, divided we fall. We as a community got to stop talking and do the work. We cannot work till somebody die again to do the work. ICE is a demon. They are not human beings. They are killers. They're killing on top.
You heard it yourself. She said they need to make the city burn. So the situation has deteriorated to an extent that President Donald Trump has warned that he may invoke the Insurrection Act of 1807 to restore order in Minnesota if state officials continue to abdicate their responsibility to protect life, property, and federal authority. This warning did not arise in a vacuum. Violent demonstrations, vandalism, assaults on law enforcement officers, and the open destruction of federal officers have become routine in Minnesota. Republican leaders in Minnesota have responded by not restoring order, but by filing lawsuits condemning federal enforcement and effectively encouraging defiance, as if they're not familiar with the supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution. When governors and mayors place partisanship and ideology above public safety, the federal government is left with a solemn but unpopular constitutional duty. That duty is embodied in the Insurrection Act of 1807. It is one of the most powerful yet misunderstood statutes in American law. Now, I'm no lawyer, but I've read enough to know that it was enacted during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. It authorizes the President of the United States to deploy federal military forces, including active duty troops or federalized National Guard units within the United States when local law enforcement mechanisms have failed. The Insurrection Act permits presidential action when the insurrection, domestic violence, or unlawful conspiracies make it impossible to enforce federal law, or when states are unwilling to protect the constitutional rights of their citizens. In short, it exists to preserve the republic when civil authority at the local level collapses. Normally, the Posse Comitatus Act prohibits the use of military forces in civilian law enforcement. The Insurrection Act serves as, in this case, a narrow but explicit exception. It has been tested in the courts. It recognizes that there are a few moments when the enforcement of law and the preservation of constitutional order require extraordinary measures. Critics claim, of course, that invoking the Insurrection Act would be authoritarian, that Trump is acting like Hitler. Let me tell you something. Anytime your political opponents start mentioning Hitler in their arguments or in their rhetoric, it means they know they are losing the public dialogue. In 1957, one of our greatest presidents, Dwight Eisenhower, very underrated as president. Dwight Eisenhower had led the invasion of Europe and the Allied command. He pretended not to be a politician, but to get to be the head of the army, voting over a number of other 4-stars. Dwight Eisenhower was a much shrewder politician than people understood. And he had this genial grandfatherly image, and he often bragged about his ability to confuse and fuzz up his answers to the media. He was one of our greatest presidents in the sense that he ended the war in Korea. He brought us unprecedented peace and prosperity. Like the presidency of Ronald Reagan, he had to go through difficult economic times in 1958, but by 1960 the economy had bounced back. And of course, in his first term, he brought us a record peace and prosperity. It was Dwight Eisenhower, ironically, who warned us about the military-industrial complex. He said that it was the accumulated power of defense contractors, those inside government who were unelected, the think tanks, the colleges. He warned us about the military-industrial complex, now known as the deep state. Dwight Eisenhower invoked the Insurrection Act in Little Rock in 1957, sending the 101st Airborne to Little Rock, Arkansas, after Governor Orville Faubus, a famous segregationist, refused to comply with a federal court order to desegregate Central High School. State officials were openly defying the Constitution. Federal troops enforced the law and protected American children who were only exercising their civil rights. In 1960, President John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson used the act to quell violent resistance to civil rights enforcement across the South. Those interventions were not acts of tyranny. They were acts of constitutional necessity. It is notable that Richard Nixon did not have to use any federal power in his, not even in the courts, to desegregate the South during his presidency. In 1992, George H.W. Bush, not my favorite president, used the act to deploy federal troops to Los Angeles after riots exploded following the Rodney King verdict. Entire neighborhoods burned to the ground while local authorities lost control. Federal intervention stabilized that city and saved lives. Each of these episodes shares a common thread. State and local governments failed. In this case, they're failing not because of incompetence, but because of politics. The federal government stepping in to preserve order, uphold the law, is what the Constitution, in this case, allows and may require. Minnesota today bears an unsettling resemblance to all these moments. Instead of enforcing the law, state leaders like Tim Walz have shown performance resistance. They have vilified federal officers encouraging mass protest, allowed professional agitators to hijack public spaces. When federal agents are attacked and the enforcement of immigration is obstructed, what exactly is the federal government supposed to do? In Chicago, Illinois, J.D. Pritzker and Brandon Johnson, the mayor of Chicago, who has a 6% approval rating, a man who, if his IQ was 1 point lower, you'd have to water him like a plant. They prohibit the city of Chicago police from assisting ICE agents whose lives are in danger. If an ICE agent in Chicago is under attack and they face imminent danger, Chicago police officers are prohibited by law in Illinois from assisting them. Legal scholars tell me that J.B. Pritzker, who's a billionaire, may have to pay some of that money out because if any of those ICE agents are injured under the Supremacy Clause, he and Mayor Johnson will be liable. The Insurrection Act is not a tool of oppression. It's a constitutional backstop. It exists for moments precisely like this one, when elected officials abandon their oath and their citizens and they begin to act politically. The question Americans must ask is whether invoking the Insurrection Act is extreme. But I think I've showed you today why it is not. We remember extremely well how Antifa and COVID and Black Lives Matter did millions and millions of dollars of damage in riots in which 32 people died and hundreds were injured, where millions of dollars of both public and private property was destroyed. In his first term, some of the president's advisors convinced him to let the governors decide when to send in the National Guard. Tim Walz waited too long, but that's because his wife said she loved to open the doors to their home in the morning and listen to and smell the burning city, that it was manna to her. That shows you how sick these people are. The question Americans must ask is whether invoking this Insurrection Act should be done. The president has a very difficult decision here to make. Law without enforcement is fiction. Rights without order are illusions. A republic that cannot defend itself and its laws will not long survive, in my opinion. If history teaches us anything, it's that presidents who invoke the Insurrection Act do so reluctantly, but always decisively, when the alternative is chaos. What you see today in the streets of Minnesota and Chicago and Seattle is chaos. And the president must use every legal authority he has to fight this scourge. In the meantime, there are persistent rumors circulating all over the social circle that former South Carolina Congressman Trey Gowdy, of all people, will be taking over for Attorney General Pam Bondi. There is no real evidence that Pam Bondi is leaving or that the president has asked her to leave. This rumor has no basis in fact. I believe this is an idea being pushed by Senator Lindsey Graham, but anyone who's really examined Trey Gowdy would recognize that he is the worst person for this job. See, Trey Gowdy is one of those Republicans who talks a good game, but his theatrics when he chaired the Benghazi hearings were disgraceful. Gowdy gained headlines, but ultimately he refused to assign the blame at where it belonged with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who manufactured the false narrative that the attack on our embassy, which was not some random act because those who attacked the embassy had the floor plan, knew where the safe room was. All of those diplomats, including our U.S. ambassador, were dragged out in the street, defiled, and murdered. And Hillary Clinton tried to persuade us and her aide Cheryl Mills that this was caused because a video critical of Allah had been aired in the Middle East. in a country where virtually no one in Iran is at that point was wired on the internet. It was a cover story, but Trey Gowdy didn't do anything about it. This guy could not have been wrong. He also defended the FBI and its actions during the Russian collusion hoax. We now know, based on the declassified documents put forward by the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, that the Russian collusion narrative was the greatest single dirty trick, the greatest single illegal hoax in American history. An abuse of power in which nothing less than the full use of the authority of the U.S. government utilized two pieces of completely fabricated information, fabricated in part by the FBI, praised by Trey Gowdy, the so-called Steele dossier, and the false claim that the Russians had conducted an online hack on the Democratic Committee. Trey Gowdy was also a stout defender of COVID-era mask tyranny. He wanted to suppress the Mueller report, which cleared President Trump of spying. And even in my case, I had to wait till a federal judge ordered the section about me be redacted by the federal government. That's because on page 178, Robert Mueller concluded he found no evidence of Russian collusion, WikiLeaks collaboration, or for that matter, any other crime on my part. That's why they had to invent the crime of lying under oath to Congress in an effort to get me to lie and turn my back on on President Donald Trump and commit perjury in the act of doing so. I, of course, refused. Once again, it was Trey Gowdy who said John Brennan should not be subjected to jail time. John Brennan, at a minimum, should be charged, and then let's let a jury decide that. Gowdy also called for an end of the Second Amendment, saying that mass shootings essentially were caused by the American people having Second Amendment rights, and that the sooner we figured out the way to stop the shootings was to take guns away from people, as opposed to looking at the use of psychotropic drugs, is yet another reason why Trey Gowdy is not the right man. I don't think there's a vacancy at the moment. Yes, I'd like to see our current Justice Department move faster when it comes to justice and accountability for those who foisted the Russian collusion hoax on us. But Trey Gowdy of South Carolina is not the man. You're listening to The Roger Stone Show, and we'll be right back.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Roger Stone Show. You know, Republicans have run against Obamacare for as long as I can remember. The House Speaker Paul Ryan ran against it. The House Speaker Kevin McCarthy ran against it. Newt Gingrich was a tough critic of it. The Senate Republicans allowed it to survive by one vote cast by John McCain, who had opposed Obamacare his entire life, but did it to spite Donald Trump. I'm not sure where John McCain is today, but my guess is it's pretty warm. And the problem, of course, is Republicans never offered a free market, workable, less expensive, more efficient alternative. Now, President Donald Trump has finally done that, taking direct aim at the cost of health care and showing that he's actually the one who is the champion of affordability, calling on Congress to pass what he's called his great health care plan, which is a sweeping proposal designed to lower drug prices, cut insurance and premiums, and finally force transparency in a healthcare system long dominated by corporate middlemen who are making a fortune. You see, Donald Trump is not the candidate of Wall Street. He is not the candidate of the insurance companies or the pharmaceutical companies. He is the president of the American people. At the core of the Trump plan is aggressive action on prescription drug prices. President Trump is now pushing to modify his most favored nation policy on drugs, ensuring that Americans will actually pay the same prices for drugs as patients in other developed countries. This approach kind of builds on President Trump's first-term insulin price reduction, something Joe Biden tried to take credit for, but was actually done by Donald Trump, and expands access to verified state medications all over the counter cutting costs and reducing unnecessary doctor visits at the same time. The plan also takes on skyrocketing insurance premiums, which is really the largest problem. Instead of spending billions in taxpayer subsidies to giant insurance companies, as we do now, President Trump wants the money sent directly to Americans, empowering individual families to choose coverage that works for them. The proposal, finally a Republican proposal, would also fund cost-sharing reductions projected to lower the premiums you pay under Obamacare by more than 10%. Also eliminating pharmacy benefit manager kickbacks that continue to quietly drive up costs. And then, of course, accountability is another key part of Trump's health care plan. And this is what we want to talk about in 2026, this versus the broken Obamacare system we have today. Trump's plan includes a plain English insurance standard requiring companies to actually clearly disclose their profits, their claim denial rates, their wait times, and ending all the fine print games that frustrate people like my aunts and uncles and used to frustrate my parents. President Trump's plan also restores complete price transparency. Medicaid would be reduced to post clear pricing up front. Rules will be established that Trump pioneered in his first term, but were then ignored by Biden. The great health care plan is put forward by Donald Trump, delivers on one simple promise: lower costs, more choice, and power returned to the patients, not bureaucrats, not pharmaceutical companies, not insurance companies, not corporate giants. Every Republican and every Democrat and every American should get behind this bill because it is superior to the system we have now under Obamacare. Democrats refuse because they just want to play politics. That will be then clear to the American people that it is the Democrats who are responsible for the failure of the healthcare system and the increase in cost. Remember, Donald Trump and the Republicans have a massive financial campaign advantage over the Democrats, so they will have more than sufficient money, since the mainstream media won't tell the American people the story, to tell the American people about this themselves. And healthcare now ranking as the number 3 issue in the country. Food prices continue to be first. Housing prices have moved into the second position, housing prices and affordability, which is good news because under Donald Trump and Housing and Federal Finance Director Bill Pulte, mortgage rates have fallen to the lowest rate in decades, and they're working on a lot more. Once we get an interest rate cut and we no longer have a totally politicized Federal Reserve, watch this economy cook.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show, entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And we're back in the Roger Stone Show. All eyes remain focused on Iran, where Iran now stands on the cusp of what I think is a historical inflection point, a moment that is fraught with both consequence and danger, but also consequences for the entire Middle East, but actually I think the entire national geopolitical architecture of the modern world. In order to understand the convulsions presently roiling the Islamic Republic, Americans must first reacquaint themselves with the truth that I think has been deliberately obscured by decades of propaganda and academic obfuscation. Iran was once a sophisticated, westernized, and relatively forward-looking nation before it was hijacked by clerical extremists. Now, I'm not saying the Shah was a paragon of human rights. He was a brutal dictator, but women were allowed to be educated. Women were allowed to be schooled. Students were allowed to study abroad. There was no danger except for to the political enemies of the regime. So which is why I say what we have today is worse than the Shah, but that's not a reason to return to a monarchy and the Shah's son. I'd like to see Iran move to a democratic society with elections. It is hard to recognize to protest in this atmosphere, given the brutality of the regime, where they have held mass public educations of political dissidents, it takes an enormous amount of courage. But the people are fed up, and because of the lack of food, because of the lack of housing, because of the total collapse of reasonable quality of life. The past of Iran was violently derailed by the Iranian Revolution. It was a seismic political rupture. Radical clerics led by the Ayatollah Khomeini overthrew the Shah and erected this current theocratic state, predicted on ideological ablutism and religious coercion. Every American remembers the embarrassment and the ignominious episodes, one of the worst episodes in American diplomatic history. On November 4th, 1979, Iranian militants stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, seized 52 American diplomats and citizens, held those diplomats for 440-odd days, where they were held hostage, subjected to physical and psychological torment, paraded repeatedly around the world for trophies of revolutionary vengeance. It was not until the hapless peanut farmer Jimmy Carter, who is the one who decided to allow the takeout of the Shah to be replaced by this chaos, left office, and the Ayatollahs realized they would have to deal with Ronald Reagan, who said he wanted our citizens back. And they finally had a president with the guts to project and use American power, and they returned our hostages. The true victims of the system are not the clerics, they're the Iranian people. The men and women increasingly reject this suffocating yoke of the mullahs. You can see that. And again, this last 2 weeks, they have poured in the streets demanding dignity, accountability, and the right to choose their own political destiny. They're not asking for cosmetic reforms. They're demanding the end of a regime that has bankrupted their economy, brutalized their young people, imprisoned their future. How long can any government endure when it rules only through fear and brutality? How long can an ideology survive when it's rejected by the very people it claims to represent? I am absolutely convinced that the regime is about to collapse on its own. Donald Trump has made it very clear that he will not tolerate the mass execution of their citizens. The official number is at 12,000 protesters have killed. My sources tell me that number is closer to 20,000. Thanks to the tough talk of Donald Trump, 800 people were spared this week who were scheduled to be executed. But Iran is very definitely teetering on the brink. This has to be watched very carefully. The president has moved his troops into the right formation. We know that he projects American power very quickly, but on a limited basis. We saw him do it in Iran before, where he took out their nuclear weapons development program. We saw him do it in Venezuela when he went in, arrested Maduro, lost not a single life, left no troops behind, no regime change. The narco-Marxists still, unfortunately, run the current government of Venezuela, but for how much longer, we don't know. Meanwhile, I've noticed the attacks on Tulsi Gabbard have turned up again. There was a fake news smear published last week in Bloomberg claiming that Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard was deliberately kept out of the loop during the plotting of the government's arrest of Venezuelan strongman Nicolas Maduro, with administration officials joking that DNI meant do not invite. But Vice President J.D. Vance, who's also attacked and implied that he was not involved, he knocked this down pretty hard. Let's listen to the Vice President.
So I've heard a couple of things. One, that I was kept out of the planning for the Venezuela operation. That's false. And another, that Tulsi was kept out of the planning for Venezuela operations. That's completely false. Look, we're all part of the same team. And one of the things that is really amazing about that operation is that we kept it very tight to the senior cabinet level officials and related officials in our government. And we kept this operation secret for a very long time. I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, I'll tell you the reason that I believe that some inside this administration, or some who were here before the administration, hope to be here when this administration leaves, are concerned about Tulsi Gabbard is because it has been reported that she, among others, has been charged with examining the voting machines, which came from Venezuela, as well as others, to determine once and for all whether those machines have been and can be manipulated by offshore actors like Venezuela, like China. I believe that proof exists. So if the voting machines can be manipulated, if they were indeed manipulated in the 2020 election, which I believe they were, there's a lot of litigation going on right now, but ultimately, Justice Tulsi Gabbard made it very clear by declassifying documents that shows that the Russian collusion narrative was a hoax, was a dirty trick, was a crime, was a coup d'etat. There are some in this government who don't want an examination about the security and capabilities of electronic voting machines. Could that be because some in our own intelligence services have used this technology to rig foreign elections in the past? Or perhaps they were even involved in what I think was the hijinks regarding the 2020 election. So I think there is a fear. Tulsi Gabbard is a woman of extraordinary principle, enormous personal discipline. She is, of course, a current lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve. She served in combat roles in Afghanistan. She used to be a Democrat until that party left her. When she was a Democrat, she was an anti-war Democrat. Today, she is an anti-war Democrat. Not an isolationist, a non-interventionist, which is what Donald Trump was elected as. And she had the courage to order the release of the damning tranche of documents that showed how the Watergate coup against President Donald Trump was ordered from the very highest echelons of the Obama regime, including, as Tulsi Gabbard herself said in a press conference, by President Barack Obama himself. The declassified documents are overwhelming evidence against CIA Director John Brennan, FBI Director James Comey, Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, National Security Advisor Susan Rice, the Special Counsel Robert Mueller, his attack dog Andrew Weissman, the Deputy Director of the FBI Andrew McCabe, James Clapper, the then Director of National Intelligence. There's now overwhelming, irrefutable evidence that they invented the Russian collusion hoax. And it is thanks to President Trump giving the order, which he gave in the first term, but which the current CIA director at that time, John Ratcliffe, did not declassify. Tulsi Gabbard has now declassified. So I think there are some in the highest reaches of the deep state who don't want Tulsi Gabbard and others to get to the bottom of the security of these voting machines. It's interesting that they go out of their way to try to put this story out. I've talked to the president. I've talked to his chief of staff. They count on Tulsi Gabbard as a full cooperative member of the team. She works in excellent concert with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, with the Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, and the president has thanked me for recommending her for his cabinet on more than one occasion. She's a woman of uncommon courage and uncommon judgment, but she supports the Don Roe doctrine in a manner that ensures peace through strength. What Tulsi Gabbard is against is not the projection of American power on an extremely limited basis, but the endless foreign war given to us by the Bidens and the Obamas and the Clintons and the George W. Bushes. I've said openly I think she will be our first woman president. That doesn't mean in 2028. I think J.D. Vance is still a strong front runner, although the heightened profile of Marco Rubio certainly demonstrates that he could be a viable candidate if he chose to. But Republicans don't normally not nominate our vice president. J.D. Vance doesn't get the credit he deserves because of the nature of his role. He has, as vice president, what is largely a behind-the-scenes role. So you don't know everything he's doing, but I know many of the things doing. I can tell you he is serving this administration, this president, and this country extraordinarily well, but he doesn't get to his own horn. That's the job of the vice president. He has very forcefully pushed back on many of these outrageous narratives, as he pushed back on the claim that Tulsi Gabbard was cut out of the loop. We heard that, yes? So I think that this is yet another attack on one of the stars of this cabinet. By the way, happy birthday to Secretary of Housing and to Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Yesterday, the 17th, was his birthday. Again, a man deeply skeptical of the deep state. He says openly that he killed his father and his brother, but a man who is making a real difference in the health of the American people, a man who's attacked relentlessly by the pharmaceutical lobby, but a man who really is following the science, and it is partly due to his leadership and the support he gets from President Trump that the child vaccination mandates were completely redone in a much safer and better way last week. You're listening to the Roger Stone Show here on the Red Apple Audio Networks, and when we come back, we have some more politics for you.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And we're back in the Roger Stone Show. Joining us shortly, investigative journalist Joel Gilbert, who has determined that Congressman Eric Swalwell, you remember him, he's the guy that the Biden Justice Department Inspector General concluded had illegally leaked classified documents designed to hurt President Donald Trump. Also, a man who broke the House rules to leak my classified testimony to a number of reporters who were dumb enough to tell me in their emails that they got my sealed classified testimony from Eric Swalwell. He is obviously now taking fashion tips from Steve Bannon because he looks like he has stopped shaving, brushing his teeth, washing his hair. Doesn't look to me like he's bathed in a while, but he has now announced that he's running for governor of California, and there's only one minor problem. He is not eligible under the Constitution of California to be elected governor because he does not own and is not a resident of the Golden State. The irony here, of course, is that Eric Swalwell defeated a longtime liberal Democrat congressman named Pete Starkney, who really stayed around too long, but Starkney had essentially moved to Washington, had given up his California residence. Swalwell challenged him in the Democrat primary, saying Pete Stark did not live there, and to beat him in the primary. But it's now clear, as Joel Gilbert, the investigative journalist who writes often for Gateway Pundit, among others, and has made a number of award-winning documentaries exposing the American left, is going to lay this out. He has set up the legal obstacles that could blow Eric Swalwell out of the race. Who can forget that time that Eric Swalwell, how would you say this diplomatically, passed gas on a national television interview? It was disgusting. But what do you expect from a pig but a grunt, as my grandfather would say? The nation doesn't need to be invaded or conquered. It can be bled dry. It can be chemically sabotaged. And frankly, that's what I fear. Our country can be hollowed out through a steady attrition of death and despair, destroying entire communities, collapsing under the weight of funerals, addiction, and fear, because that's what Chinese fentanyl and other poisonous precursors trafficked here in the United States are doing. And that's why the president's decision to designate fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction is not merely some rhetorical flourish. This carnage didn't just materialize out of thin air. It's been the product of both random misfortune or bad luck. It is rather than to say the product of random misfortune or bad luck. This is the outcome of the international pipeline of death that was allowed under Joe Biden. Mexican cartels and other narco-terrorist enterprises, along with millions of legal terrorists and drug dealers were allowed to openly enter our country. And when the cold professionalism wartime logistics operation was kind of the way they did it. This wasn't merely trafficking. It was a weaponized supply chain. To understand how we arrived here, one has to understand the lie that launched modern opioid epidemic. This is coming to us from Mexico, from Honduras, and Venezuela, and Donald Trump is going to stop it. We'll be right back on the other side.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Roger Stone Show. You may be familiar with Congressman Eric Swalwell, a virulent critic of President Trump. He unfortunately got caught having an extramarital affair with a communist Chinese spy named Feng Feng. He penetrated her and she penetrated his office with an intern. The problem with that, of course, is that he had access as a member of the House Intelligence Committee to classified documents that, according to the Biden Department Inspector General, he and his BFF, Adam Schiff, both leaked illegally to try to smear President Donald Trump. More recently, the fact, first of all, that Pelosi would not remove him from the Intelligence Committee, given his being compromised by a red Chinese spy from China. This is a guy who called me a Russian communist spy for years with no real proof of that. He also leaked my classified testimony in violation of both the law and House rules. And he worked hand in glove with Robert Mueller in order to set up a bunch of gotcha questions where I did, in fact, make misstatements to the House Intelligence Committee under oath. On the other hand, none of those statements were material, which is required under the law. I just didn't have a fair judge or a fair jury, and my lawyers were very adept at proving that I had no motive to lie. To lie covering up what? The Russian collusion? There was none. The WikiLeaks collaboration? None of that either. In fact, on page 178 of Robert Mueller's long hidden, long redacted final report, which we only know of today because a federal judge ordered him to release it, and they released it on midnight of Election Day in 2020, the busiest media day of the year, to make sure no one covered it. Mueller found no evidence against me regarding Russian collusion, WikiLeaks collaboration, or any other crime. Joel Gilbert was a strong and valued supporter during that fight for my life. But more than that, he's an extraordinary investigative journalist and documentary filmmaker. His film about Danny Williams, the black son of Bill Clinton, and Bobby Ann Williams, a sadly drug-addicted prostitute, which is available on YouTube, Banished, the Danny Williams story, Danney, an extraordinary piece of very effective and completely truthful filmmaking. He's also did major work exposing Kamala Harris's record of abuse. And as I say, he was one of the earliest critics of Letitia James. He teamed up with our good friend Sam Antar, another great investigative reporter, to ferret out a 43-year history of serial mortgage fraud. Letitia James was indicted in the Eastern District of Virginia for crimes that she herself has prosecuted people in New York State for. And it's a documents crime, which means she signed a document under oath, wasn't checking a box, wasn't a form document, a specific document, which she claimed that she would be a Virginia resident and she would get a lower interest rate and insurance rate and a tax break because she was not a New York State resident. But you can't be the Attorney General of New York if you're a registrant of Virginia. Anybody else would be prosecuted for that crime. That just touches the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Letitia James. But Joel Gilbert, one of the best journalists in the country, exposing numerous problems with Letitia James' record of criminality. But now he is among the first in the country to figure out that Eric Swalwell not only made misrepresentations in his mortgage, but in those misrepresentations, he reveals the fact that even though he is now openly and legally a candidate for governor of California, he's not really eligible to be governor of California. Joel Gilbert, welcome to the Roger Stone Show.
Hey, Roger, great to be here, and that's a good summation because Eric Swalwell swore in his mortgage documents in Washington, D.C. that it would be his primary residence. He did that in order to get the lowest interest rates possible. But the California Constitution says in order to run for governor of California, you have to be a resident of the state for 5 years prior to the election. So either Swalwell is guilty of mortgage fraud in Washington, D.C., or he's ineligible to run for governor. He can't have it both ways. And I actually have been covering this, and I filed a petition with the state of California to force the Secretary of State to disqualify Swalwell as ineligible because he has no address in California. He perjured himself on his candidate statement, his official candidate statement number 501 that he was required to file. He used his attorney's address for his home address, which you can't do. So I'm looking to see him disqualified, and I have a petition currently before the state of California to get him disqualified.
Joel, technically, who in California at this point makes that decision?
The Secretary of State is required by law to enforce the California state election law. So I'm asking the court, I have a judge named Shelley Ann Chang, who seems to be a straight-up judge in Sacramento, who's presiding over this case, and we're going to have a hearing. I've applied to get a hearing very soon, and in that hearing, I'm hoping and expecting she will order the Secretary of State to do her job, and we're going to see how it plays out.
Swalwell's abode in Washington, D.C., kind of a swanky six-bed mansion valued at $1.2 million, kind of swish property for a guy who continues on his financial disclosures to show enormous credit card and college debt.
Yeah, he's got serious financial issues. Number one, he cashed out his pension from when he used to be a California prosecutor in Alameda County. That's a big red flag for a younger person to cash out a pension. He still owes $100,000 on his student loans. He still owes $100,000 in credit cards. Nothing has changed in 14 years in Congress. He's been making $174,000 a year, but he hasn't paid down his debt, and he can't afford, obviously, to own a home in California. Now, if you contrast this, I looked at Maxine Waters, of all people. Maxine Waters has a home in Los Angeles, and on her mortgage document in Washington, D.C. for her condo, she says it's going to be her second home. So she pays a higher interest rate because she tells the bank it's her second home. So she actually is eligible if she wanted to run for governor of California. Swalwell,
even though her California resident, I think in very Tony Hancock Park, is not in the extraordinarily poor district she represents.
No, absolutely not. But she technically would be eligible, whereas Swalwell has no home in California, no rental, never owned property, and he only owns this home in Washington, D.C., and when you look at his financial mess, you understand why he can't afford to have a home in California. And I actually went to his town hall. He held a town hall in Santa Monica High School last Friday. And I went there. He said it would be a 2-hour town hall. He said, you can ask me anything. Swalwell came around and shook everybody's hand. I wasn't expecting that. He looked me in the eye. I shook his hand. I said, thanks for coming. He said, nice to meet you. And I could see kind of a panic in his eyes. And then he went up and only took 6 questions. After 20 minutes, he cut off the town hall. And I got in line to take a photo with him so I could ask him a question during the photo session. And 3 of his goons came up to me and said, what's your plan? I said, to take a photo. They said, we're not going to allow that. And they forced me to leave. So Swalwell, I think he's kind of a wannabe tyrant. I think he plans to become governor of California and lead a anti-Trump insurrection. And then I think he wants to run for president. That's what I see him doing because he's staking out all these far-left positions. He knows that if he runs for governor as a Democrat, he knows that if you win the primary, you're automatically become governor because it's a one-party state. So he's staking out these far-left positions because he knows the people that vote in the primaries are the far-left activists. So I've got him figured out. That's exactly what he's up to.
Yeah, he faces a very, I would say, influential field. Democratic Congresswoman Katie Porter, who has some of the weirdest eyes I've ever seen. I saw a video of her recently talking about how her daughter cried the night Trump was returned to the presidency because, well, what would happen if she needed an abortion and she couldn't get one? She lost the Senate race to Adam Schiff, although she's a protege of the Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, and she's a very prodigious fundraiser. Former Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa trying to make a political comeback. Latinos are very, very important within the California electorate, both in general elections and within the Democrat primary. Of course, Republican Steve Hilton is running. California has this odd, what they call jungle primary system, which the parties no longer have party primaries, but every candidate who wants to run, both Republican, Democrat, or Independent, anybody who can get on the ballot runs in one-time primary, and then the two top vote getters face off against each other. So, God forbid you could actually have a choice between Eric Swalwell and Katie Porter. God
Correct.
forbid. Although Swalwell, it takes enormous amounts of money. It's an extremely expensive state to run in, very expensive media markets. I don't, even if Swalwell survives this legal challenge to his being on the ballot, which frankly, now that Joel Gilbert is focused on it, I don't think he will. I think he faces a very, very uphill race. How would you contrast his situation with what we know about the guy for whom he is the Sancho Panza, Adam Schiff? Remember Adam Schiff? He's the guy who said repeatedly that he had seen more than circumstantial evidence of Russian collusion with Donald Trump's campaign, and then never produced any whatsoever. And then when pressed about that, he said, well, Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, shared polling information with a Russian intelligence asset named Konstantin Kilimnik, and there's your Russian collusion. The problem with that is that Kilimnik was a U.S. intelligence asset, as the independent journalist Matt Taibbi has proven, but also as the documents, the declassified documents from our embassy in Kyiv prove. So they turned up nothing of the kind. But Adam Schiff has some issues regarding his mortgages, as I recall.
Correct. Look, let me tell you about Eric Swalwell. He said in this town hall, he said his mentors in Congress are Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff. Those are his two BFFs in Congress. He's not a very smart guy. He speaks in cliches. All he does is give these little cliches. He's not a good speaker. He doesn't have much of a personality. But he, puts on this 2-day-old growth beard, and he uses a lot of curse words. He likes to curse. He thinks that makes him look hip or cool.
A lot of dropping the F-bomb. Yeah, I've noticed that.
Yeah, and so I think he's identified, look, a lot of far-left radical activists are the ones that come out for this Democrat primary. Those are the ones I want to appeal to. I can get that vote, and then I'll become governor because the Democrat always becomes governor. But he is under investigation. Bill Pulte from the FHFA referred him to the Department of Justice for mortgage fraud. If he insists that he lives in California, he's guilty of mortgage fraud in D.C. because he got the lowest interest rate by saying it was his primary residence. I think there's a great chance he gets disqualified because he hasn't lived in California for 10 years, and you have to be a resident of the state for 5 years prior to an election. But Swalwell has definitely cast himself as a Bernie Sanders, radical, far-left socialist to get power. And that's a very dangerous person who really has no ethics, no basis, no experience in life except for trying to get power, and that's what he's up to right now.
Well, I don't think we can just forget his dalliance with the Russian spy Feng Feng, who infiltrated his office and with whom he had an extramarital affair when he was a member of the House Intelligence Committee. Well, I'm sure she wasn't interested in him for his studly good looks. The guy is getting style tips from Steve Bannon, from what I can say.
Right.
I mean, he rarely looks like he's bathed.
Let me tell you about the Fang Fang thing. Look, this Chinese woman shows up at the University of California. She looks 10 years older than any other student. She's definitely an older person, and she becomes the president of all these different organizations, and she starts warming up to different politicians. She clearly targeted Swalwell because he was an up-and-comer, because he was on the House Intelligence Committee and in charge of CIA funding. And he places an intern in her office. That's what intelligence assets do. They try to infiltrate the person's operation. Don't forget, Dianne Feinstein had a driver for 20 years who was a Chinese spy. We have pictures of Fang Fang with that driver. So Swalwell is very problematic even as a congressman, let alone becoming governor. But I believe that he wants to become governor so he can lead this anti-Trump insurrection and then run for president. I have no doubt that that's his plan.
All right, we're talking to Joel Gilbert, who has reported this story, big story today in the UK Daily Mail, based on the actions by Joel Gilbert and to knock Eric Swalwell off the ballot. A little more with our friend Joel Gilbert when we come back to the Roger Stone Show.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network. Roger Stone Show. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Roger Stone Show. We're still talking to the documentary filmmaker and investigative journalist Joel Gilbert. Joel, how can people follow you on social media?
I'm at Joel S. Gilbert on Twitter X, Joel S. Gilbert. I'm posting every day about Swalwell, covering him in the Gateway Pundit. Daily Mail's picking up the story. Hopefully Fox and New York Post and others will pick it up too. And all my films are available highway61ent.com for entertainment, highway61ent.com. And keep checking the Gateway Pundit. I put up articles there, seems like a couple times a week. There's a lot more to come on Swalwell. I just got started.
The other great thing about Joel Gilbert is he's a very accomplished musician, and he fronted a Bob Dylan tribute band for many years. He's an extraordinary musician, a performer, and like me, a devotee to Bob Dylan. Of all of Dylan's periods, what was your favorite period, Joel?
Look, I think favorite or most fascinating is his religious period. He, grew up in a small town, Minnesota, Jewish, and he got caught up in the Jesus movement in Hollywood in the late 70s, and he made 3 religious albums, including the Grammy-winning Slow Train Comin', Gotta Serve Somebody, and it's really fascinating how he just found all these stories in the Bible and decided to write about them, and how he took on a whole new audience of Christians and evangelicals with what I think today stands as some of his best work, the religious music that he put out for 3 years.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that, although I would say Blood on the Tracks could still be my favorite album. And my all-time favorite, the story of New Jersey boxer Hurricane Carter. Well,
I actually I met the Hurricane. I interviewed him, and I was the only person to ever interview him for one of my films on Bob Dylan. I can tell you a lot of people don't like to hear it, but he actually was very guilty. He really did murder those 4 people. And he had so much charisma, he actually was able to talk his way out of prison and convince Bob Dylan to write this song about him being innocent. But even Dylan found out later that Hurricane Reuben Carter was guilty, and he never sang that song again after 1977 when he realized that he'd been had and that Reuben Carter was a murderer.
That's amazing. So I guess an apology is owed to the Paterson, New Jersey police, who they falsely claimed set Reuben Hurricane Carter up. I also have to be a fan. I liked the very early material, the earliest material, the Greenwich Village coffee scene material, his breakthrough songs, Blowing in the Wind, We Shall Not Be Moved, and so on. Bob Dylan.
Yeah, for the Freewheelin' album, Times Are A-Changin', and Another Side of Bob Dylan, he really wrote about the protest movement with Blowing in the Wind, Times Are A-Changing. He really led it with his music. And then he kind of moved on. He was really good at writing about what was going on around him. If it was the religious movement in L.A., he wrote about Jesus. If it was the protest movement in the 60s, he wrote about that. So he was kind of an interpreter of what was happening around him, but he never wanted to lead a movement or to become a social figure. That was for Joan Baez and people like that who wanted to lead a movement of protest. Dylan just liked to write about it and then move on.
I don't think he did this for commercial purposes, but he reinvented himself, and his music changed. He also changed, and of course, there was scandalism in the folk community when he went electric at the Newport Jazz Festival, a folk festival.
Well, what people don't know is Dylan was a rock and roller in high school. When he was in high school, he had bands. And he only got into folk music because he fell in love with Woody Guthrie and started singing all these Woody Guthrie songs. He was kind of a Woody Guthrie jukebox for a couple of years. And then he really went back to the electric music, which was really his roots.
All right, we got to leave it there, I'm afraid. Thanks for joining us today on The Roger Stone Show.
Thanks for listening to The Roger Stone Show. You can hear The Roger Stone Show Sunday afternoons at 3. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode so you never have to wonder,
what the heck is going on here?
Every week, the Payne family cuts straight to the real financial story.
The one question, Bob, everyone's asking is, are we in an artificial intelligence bubble? You've been through boom and bust. What do you think?
No hype, no myths. Just what actually matters to your money.
Does feel very similar to what we experienced in the 90s. Where are we, though? Are we in 1995, 1997, 1999?
Listen to the Pain Points of Wealth on the Red Apple Podcast Network.